I don't think that there's a genre that's left quite the impact on the general audience and internet culture quite like mid-2000s rock. That time right after nu metal died and was replaced with a more fleshed out sound with similar elements in tandem with the growing goth culture of that era was definitely a memorable time, for better or worse. With that decade coinciding with the internet becoming mainstream but still filled with outsider culture, bands like Linkin Park, Evanescence, and 3 Days Grace exploded in popularity and still maintain a place in the public consciousness to this day. A side effect of this is that bands that would have been overlooked or forgotten otherwise have kept commendable followings based solely on the number of eyes that were on that genre at the time. Examples would be bands like Papa Roach, who were only known for one over-the-top single, or Seether, who were big but didn't have the staying power of their contemporaries, and the band we're going to be talking about today, Finger Eleven, for their hit song 2007 titled Paralyzer.
Paralyzer was a single released on January 30th, 2007 by Finger Eleven, a Canadian alt-rock band formed in 1990. The members are all peers from their high school in Burlington, Ontario. They debuted at their school's Christmas concert under their original name.
It was a different time.
They initially only did covers for school events, not taking music that seriously, but eventually got the opportunity to release their first original album in 1995. With funding and a deal with Mercury Records they got from a talent searching contest off a popular radio station in their area. The album was titled Letters from Chutney, and it's a pretty solid grunge record with obvious influences being Faith No More and Alice in Chains. After Chutney's release, the band finally realized that their name was a terrible idea if they wanted to be taken seriously, plus they wanted to adapt themselves with the changing sound ideas from their next project. Mercury Records disapproved of this change in branding and eventually dropped them from the label, but not before they released their other debut album, titled Tip. For those curious, the name Finger Eleven came from a scrapped lyric off their song Thin Spirits, and according to lead singer Scott Anderson, it means, when everything is pushing you in one direction, and your instincts drive you in another, that's Finger 11.
Ah, alright. Or it could just be a dick joke.
Some of Tip's singles did well on Canada's rock charts, and from what I've listened to, it's an alright reintroduction that shows they're willing to change with the times. Their next album, 2000's The Greyest of Blue Skies, now released under Wind Up Records, would continue their success in their home country. It quickly went gold, and a lot of the songs off of it made into TV show and movie soundtracks. Most notably, the songs Drag You Down and First Time appeared in the 4th Dragon Ball Z movie, and the song Stay and Drown appears in the 5th.
For some reason, I'm in no way surprised by this connection.
This upward momentum would continue on their next self-titled album in 2003. This album gave them their first taste of the US Hot 100, with its lead single One Thing exploding in popularity, peaking on the charts at number 16 in October of 2004.
If I knew all about this one thing.
One Thing wasn't the song the band expected to be successful. They were expecting the harder sounding Stay in Shadow, which is a better song in my opinion. One Thing is a slow and heavy guitar ballad about regret, which isn't new for the genre, but it's an interesting change of pace from the rest of the album, which is full of pretty standard post-nu metal alt-rock. It's a well-executed song, but honestly, nothing about it is interesting enough to warrant examining at length. The only notable thing is how different it is from the rest of their discography up to that point. When I said they were good at changing with the times, that also meant their music after the name change tended to not stand out that much. You can listen to any song from this and previous albums and immediately recognize the sound they're emulating, intentionally or no. That's an issue they've always faced, but their flanderization really started being noticeable around their self-titled album. Them changing up their sound for this song at least shows a willingness to experiment that I can commend, and to be fair, they pull off this acoustic sound very well. And the change must have worked in their favor either way, seeing as this is one of their biggest hits. One Thing isn't an amazing song, and there's not much to examine on its surface, but it gets props in my eyes for showing some attempt to branch out their sound. Finger Eleven's Finger Eleven was Finger Eleven's biggest album ever. The album went platinum in Canada, and it also broke them through to going gold in America. They were winning awards and opening on tour for acts like Nickelback and Evanescence. This album and single were the final push that truly broke Finger Eleven into the mainstream. Also, a funny one-off anecdote, apparently while they were working on this album, there were rumors that the band had broken up, and instead of just saying they were still together, they set up a 24-hour phone line so fans could talk to them in the studio at any time. It's a great story, but take it with a grain of salt. It is just a random footnote on Wikipedia, and apparently I'd have to buy a 2-decade-old magazine issue to fully confirm it.
I'm not that stupid.
Their fifth album, Them vs. You vs. Me, released in March of 2007. This album brought back that funk-inspired groovy grunge off Tip and Letters from Chutney, but with a slicker late 2000s production, as well as more acoustic elements for the One Thing crowd. A comparison I saw a lot in reviews was Maroon 5's Songs About Jane, both stylistically and the fact that this is their most varied and arguably best album. They released their first single off the album in January of that year, and over the following months it slowly built up to being the biggest song in the history of their careers.
Now, something you need to understand before I continue is that Paralyzer slaps.
I will make it no secret that I think this is a great song. It's not the best hit from that time, but I can't deny that riff, you know? Even with how simple it is, it's pretty effective. Apparently the band just improv'd the riff during a photography session, and the groove captivated them so much that they knew they needed to make it a full song, and I don't blame them. It really is a great riff, and its simple yet compelling melody, along with the imagery and the lyrics of a dimly lit, crowded club, remind me a lot of the good time-centric pop songs we would get a few years later. The best way I can describe Paralyzer is a club banger in alt-rock's clothing. You could replace the guitar line with a synth and add a booming beat behind it, and it would make a pretty sick Usher song. But it still has that late 2000s alt-rock edge that makes it feel more angsty and dangerous than if it were just straight pop, which also helps sell its subject matter. The song is about the band's disdain for club culture, and how they feel more comfortable in dingy bars than in cold electronic dance halls. The sounds complement that theme by having the same funk as club music with that darker rock twist to show the lack of connection between the singer and the location's atmosphere. It perfectly balances that cynicism with its energy to keep its pop-influenced funk while not detracting from it with the song's tone of actively dismissing the places these songs would be played in. That's a lot of art teacher overanalyzing, but long story short,
yeah, I like the Quagmire Toilet song, what of it, bitch?
One thing I can complain about, you get it, is like the other one, is its overall legacy, though it's not really the song's fault per se. Paralyzer is the type of song that, unless you have some nostalgic connection to it, you only know about it once you're reminded of it, and you remember how big it really was. It spent close to a year in the Hot 100, peaking at number 6, it went double platinum, and yet it's remembered mostly for its connection to early internet culture, and not that much on its own merit. I'm not saying no one remembered the song, but it's kinda sad that a side effect of the resurgence will be everyone who hears it thinking of a character from Family Guy turning into a toilet. Finger Eleven in general weren't either consistently good enough to be a classic band like Paramore, and they weren't eye or ear-catching enough to have the reputation of people like Pierce the Veil or early Panic at the Disco. Another reason I can think of is that funk-infused rock unfortunately wasn't as fresh a concept in 2007 as it was in 1995. In its attempt to not sound like the music of yesterday, it instead blended into the music of then. The song drew some criticism for sorta sounding like Take Me Out by Franz Ferdinand, another fluke rock hit from a few years before. The similarities are surface level, but it shows that the style wasn't new anymore and has already been scoring other bands' hits for years. I still like Paralyzer in a vacuum, but culturally it hasn't left the biggest impression. Them vs. You vs. Me was a pretty successful album, though not as big as the previous, which is funny considering it made their most recognizable song. It sold over 600,000 copies in its first year, and critics were overall positive, calling the album a good evolution of their sound, but also being somewhat forgettable. The album eventually went gold in the US, and it won Rock Album of the Year at the 2008 Juno Awards. Don't ask why it won an award in a year it wasn't released in. Music awards are stupid. Moving on. The follow-up album would be released in October of 2010, titled Life Turns Electric. So, with the 1-2 punch of previous success, how did they go about continuing their momentum?
Well, if the last album was Songs About Jane, then this would be if Maroon 5 immediately went to Moves Like Jagger.
The lead single, Living in a Dream, is a pretty blatant attempt to replicate Paralyzer's magic. An understandable decision, and it kinda bops, but Paralyzer was definitely lightning in a bottle that they couldn't recapture that easily. The song did get number 3 on Canada's rock charts, but only peaked at 13 in the US alternative charts, and for a fraction of Paralyzer's time. The next single, Whatever Doesn't Kill Me, ironically reminds me of
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
And to be clear, I like that song, but Whatever Doesn't Kill Me feels too sanitized to have that punch earlier similar tracks by them would have, and it seems like that's the consensus for the album as a whole. A lot of reviews say it's too middle of the road to have any strong opinions on, and it has none of the believable, gritty, dark emotions that they were in their element with, which is definitely a negative when your band is known for angsty funk jams. Whatever Doesn't Kill Me was a number 1 hit on Canada's rock charts, and the other singles did pretty well in their home country too, which I get it. It's not like it's a bad album. I liked the song Good Intentions, and although it failed at its goal, I thought Living in a Dream still had a groove, but it just feels underwhelming as a standalone project and as a follow-up to them versus You Versus Me. I saw this one user review somewhere, and it's obviously a joke, but it pretty accurately portrayed how people saw the album. I'm normally not the kind of person to agree with this selling out argument, and looking at interviews, the band seem really proud of this new direction, but Life Goes Electric just feels too watered down and safe to have the smashing success of previous records. After Life Goes Electric, the band would take a 5-year hiatus. In 2013, the band would announce the beginnings of a new album, as well as the fact that longtime drummer Rich Bedeau had left the band. I'm sure everyone watching who became Finger 11 superfans 12 minutes ago are devastated. They would eventually return to performing in 2015 on a tour with 3 Days Grace, and on July 31st, they would release their most recent project, 5 Crooked Lines. Thankfully, on this album, they did course correct from being standard clean pop rock back to their forte of
And saw it.
In interviews, Scott Anderson said they felt tired of the overproduction of their bigger records, so they brought back the raw alt-rock style they had before their peak albums.
Meaning they're now continuing their tradition of sounding like a Discount Disturbed. In 2015.
It sounds questionable, but luckily the album doesn't sound questionable. This album was produced by Dave Cobb, a producer based in Nashville, mainly known for working with country artists, which helped the band reach the more natural sound they were aiming for. The album's lead single, Wolves and Doors, definitely feels like something off the self-titled album, and other songs like Gods of Speed could fit pretty well off Tip or Letters from Chutney. Although songs like Not Going to Be Afraid do still have that safe energy off the last album, but songs like that are fortunately a small minority. This shift back to a raw sound seemed to win back the public, with many reviews being fairly positive and praising them for going back to being not that memorable. Wolves and Doors peaked at number 4 on Canada's rock charts, and the album as a whole were close to the top 40 for US rock albums, so they could still bring some buzz for a new release even after a hiatus, but the album only charted for a week before fizzling out. I think a big reason why this album didn't last long is mainly the landscape of alternative changing drastically since they left. I want to remind you, they're doing a pastiche of their 2003 alt-rock in the year of our Lord 2015. The number 1 alternative song of that year was Walk the Moon's Shut Up and Dance. The chart toppers for rock were less Bring Me to Life and more Bring Me the Horizon. It's not like a band like them couldn't get a hit then, but that mid-2000s alt-rock sound and even the cleaner stuff off Life Turns Electric were pretty out of style by that point. 5 Crooked Lines has been Finger 11's most recent project. Besides some vague statements about something being on the way, there's been no news or announcements for a new album. Their most recent release was a pretty solid acoustic cover of Paralyzer in October of 2020 to celebrate the original hitting 100 million plays on Spotify. In June of 2018, the band performed back in Ontario under their original name that I refuse to say out loud for the first time in over 20 years. They regularly tour to this day, albeit less than usual recently for obvious reasons, and they still have a very loyal fanbase. Finger 11 is right in the middle in terms of continuing relevance. They weren't consistent enough to be widely acclaimed to this day, but they also weren't laughingstocks, only remembered for showing the worst of their genre.
I swear, I don't hate Papa Roach, they're just a very easy target.
They were just a solid band with some solid hits, which isn't huge, but it's basically all they needed. When I started listening through their discography, I initially thought that Paralyzer and One Thing were outliers in terms of quality, and the band simply were too hit or miss to become mainstays. I can confidently say now that Life Turns Electric was a pretty bad follow-up to their success, and that's most likely likely the biggest roadblock in retaining that popularity, but a lot of the deep cuts off the albums from their peak are really good tracks that happen to not have the anthemic energy or emotional weight of their two biggest songs. Finger Eleven isn't one of the biggest or even one of the best bands from that time, but I would highly recommend most of their discography if you're interested in this era of music, or just a connoisseur of some quality alt-rock.
Making videos like this has always been an interesting way for me of finding good overlooked artists, or at least underappreciated artists with a good story. Before this video, the only thought I had about Finger Eleven was, wow, Paralyzer is a good song. But now that I know what I know, I'm like, wow, Paralyzer is a good song. Also, what the fuck kind of name is Rainbow Butt Monkeys? I do look back at this era of music pretty fondly, even though I probably wouldn't consider any artist from it one of my favorites. I grew up with this era being the childhood sound of rock, and looking back, there's a lot of gems that most people probably don't give it credit for. You can dismiss this genre as just corny angst music, and to be fair, a lot of the worst of it is, but there's a lot of really quality artists out there that unfortunately never went to the heights of even people like Finger Eleven. Being honest, I really didn't expect a lot from Finger Eleven. Like I said, I only thought that Paralyzer and maybe One Thing were their only good songs, but looking into it, a lot of the deep cuts off of their albums are actually surprisingly good grunge or post-alt-rock sound. But fortunately I, and now you, know the story of Finger Eleven and have a pretty reasonable explanation as to why they aren't as big now as they were back then. If you like the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe if you want to see me ramble about things no one else cares about again. That's it for this, and before I go, I want to complain about something real quick. For those curious, I did actually buy this magazine, partly as a joke and a little bit to actually help me with the research process. And there is a little thing about that phone line that I mentioned on like page 30 or something, but it's just like a tiny blurb on one page, and now that I'm done with this video, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with this. I eventually thought that I could just write it into a joke in the video, so I at least get more out of it than knowing that Finger Eleven did in fact do this thing. But the real thing I want to complain about is that while I was looking for visuals for the voiceover parts of this video, I found an interview clip from 2007 where they're just casually talking about the phone line that apparently no one can confirm.
The fan phone.
Yeah.
Why was that
Yes.
something you thought was in the best interest of the band? Because I thought it was a pretty neat idea.
We'd been away for a long time and we were in seclusion. There wasn't much of an outside world, so we're like, we should let people know that we're doing something.
We're still together. You know, I think some people thought we might have broken up or something.
Really?
You know, you're away for so long, and then as you're making a record that you hope people are going to care about, we had people calling in from all around the world and saying, you know,
Hurry
we
up.
can't wait. So as we were making the record, it's probably the greatest time to actually know that people still care.
So now, thankfully, I guess I have more confirmation that this is true, but more importantly to me, I had no reason to buy this, and I wasted $15. And now when I look over at my shelf of things that I no longer care about, I have to be stared at by Quentin Tarantino's dumb square face. This is what I do for you people. These are the lengths that I go for content. Anyways, now that you understand my inner pain, I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.